Aloha, I'm Lahaina Lee, and welcome to the Maui Real Estate Advisor podcast. This is your guide to navigating Maui's unique real estate market. Whether you live on island, own property here, or considering making Maui your home, this podcast offers expert insights, market updates, and practical tips to help you make informed decisions. And this week, no stats. Instead, we're going to get into the most recent updates on the plans for the commercial corridor, which includes our beloved Front Street. And really, these aren't the plans, they are the plans for planning the plan. Confused yet? Well, then I already feel like a government official. More seriously, I want to talk about and show you what came out of the workshops in Lahaina that were held from Tuesday the 24th through Thursday evening the 26th. These sessions focused on mobility in and around the commercial corridor. And for those of you listening while driving and not watching on YouTube, my apologies. I'll do the best I can to paint a picture with words. One of the primary concerns I had going into the meeting is how do you plan mobility to and from Front Street, up and down Front Street, if you don't even know what's going to be on Front Street? How are we going to keep the character that has made Front Street one of the most celebrated streets in America, maybe even in the world? Well, that's still a concern. The workshops were not what I expected, but my overall reaction is still more positive than negative. What I was expecting was there would be a series of meetings with the public and decision makers, and they might be kind of in a roundtable format where we sit around and talk and maybe even argue about ideas. What it turned out to be was 2 days of input followed by a Pauhana wrap-up. Here's how it worked and the conclusions of the process. Day one was in a large room set up kind of in a horseshoe shape, starting at one end with easels and aerial maps and stations where the public could walk around, talk to some of the architects and the city planners that have been hired to help the county of Maui in the rebuilding of Lahaina, and get reactions and input. Initially, I was disappointed that we were talking to contractors and county employees who were really not at the decision-making level. But we did get to put in our 2 cents. That process started with maps and renderings that were initially there to orient us and then take input in different ways. Let's look at some of the maps. This first map is also the first map that we saw, and so this was to get us oriented. So let me get you a little bit oriented here. This red line down here where you see the 18 and the 19 are the northern boundary of the commercial corridor of Lahaina town. If you follow the highway down, oh, by the way, that's Baker Street. If you follow the highway down all the way to Prison Street, we have a line defining the southern border of the commercial corridor. So that is Prison Street again. And if you're watching, you can see that takes a little jog around, down by the harbor, around Pioneer Inn, takes a little jog around the corner, around Pioneer Inn, and then back up to Baker Street. So if you see this little building right here at the northwest corner of Baker Street, that would be the Methodist Church. Now, if we come back to the southern border of the commercial corridor, taking a look at the southern border, if you draw a line down the highway to Shaw Street, or maybe down Waianae Street to Shaw Street, that area from Waianae down to the shoreline, many of you have seen this, been around this area, and know that that was really thought to be something to be redeveloped, taken back to its original nature. And that area is being called the Royal Complex. And so it would appear that there are plans to make that happen. And so that would be just a beautiful part of Lahaina down there. And that would run along the shoreline and back through the harbor. So there actually be some overlap between the commercial corridor and the Royal Complex down here by the banyan tree. Now, on this map, each of one of these dots represents a location. And after we looked at these dots, we had a chance to walk around the room and actually identify and make comments about observations that they had made, drawings that they had made, et cetera, about the dots. And so number 5 out here, that big building with the X's, that's Ainanalu. That's where I used to live. And so when we walked around the room, I got to see their rendering of what that street looked like. So this is it, number 5. And on this street, it shows one side of the street is a parking lot. And so if we were coming from north headed south, there would be a parking lot on the right-hand side of the street. They also show a parking lot on the left-hand side of the street. That is not a parking lot. That is my home. That is Ainanalu. So I had an opportunity to give some input and make some corrections. Now, I'm not going to show you all the maps and the renderings and the drawings because there were dozens and dozens, and we'll all just get confused. What I do want to do is show you a couple where it sort of illustrates the kinds of thoughts that were going on and the topics that were being discussed. So in this map, what you can see is a portion of Front Street. It's got a green stripe. That represents that there is no automobile traffic on that street. It is strictly pedestrian. And so what they were trying to do is show some ways that we could move more safely, more easily, create more community. And closing Front Street to traffic was one of those suggestions. And on this one, you can see that traffic would have to go down Luakini. And for those of you who know Luakini Street, it's really not much more than an alley, but in this scenario, that would get a bit more use. And then another cut, sort of at the same thing, was having Front Street be a one-way street. So there would be some traffic, but much less traffic. And they had some ways to kind of slow that down. As you can see, people are putting Post-it notes on, making suggestions, giving ideas about what they would like to see there. And you can see on this particular map, again, it has Luakini, but it's not necessarily a one-way street. And it stops right here at, this would be Lahaina Luna. So that's a bit of how the idea of traffic and mobility, walking, driving, riding bikes, whatever, could work in and around a new Lahaina town. Another cut was just kind of what the streets themselves might look like. And so this was one of the more interesting ones. What this shows you is Front Street and the seawall. And it notes here it's one way and it has curbs. And so there were other ideas presented with two-way traffic. I don't actually remember too much of that, but there were also some with no curbs and Front Street looked like a plaza. So what you see here, this I can only imagine is Front Street, as there are people dining atop the restaurant. And as you can see out here on the sidewalk, they've also got sidewalk dining. And of course, anyone who's walked down Front Street in the last 20 years knows that there's no room for al fresco dining. So that might imply that these curbs would be wider, the streets would be narrower. It's still using our imagination. And down here, you can see that there's a car, and that car is either parked or it is going south on Front Street. So some of the ideas, and I'll actually show you those, are how Front Street is going to flow. And so this is one that shows some flow. So this is Papala'ua, and coming into Front Street, you can see that this rendering imagines that from Papala'ua north towards Anapali, there's two-way traffic. Papala'ua south down Front Street is one way. And this little space right here, well, that used to be Tommy Bahama's Marlin Bar. Great martinis there, by the way. But anyway, this is just some of the ways that they see that oceanfront frontage might look and how the traffic might flow. So there were several renderings like that. And from all of that, there was a compilation, and then the next night, we had a big meeting and got to see some of the conclusions. And so in the concluding night, the Pauhana, we got to see some renderings of kind of what the streets look like now and what the streets might look like in the future. And so on this, what you see is the highway, you see Waine'i Street, you see Luakini, and then finally you see Front Street. So those are the four streets that run through central part of Lahaina. And what they were illustrating here was trying to create better flow and better connectivity. One was by taking Luakini Street, which was between Waine'i and Front Street, and extending that on through all the way to Baker Street. I'll come back to that. And what you see at the top of the drawing between Waine'i and the highway are some little places where Baker Street, for example, didn't go through to the highway. So by extending that connection, as well as a couple of other places that didn't quite go through to the highway, it would create better access connectivity so that, heaven forbid, in the event of another situation where we had to evacuate, there'd be better access to get up to the roads. And it's notable, I think, that you see Luakini here being extended through a rather large block. In that building where you see the red line going right through the middle of the building, that's Foodland. So obviously that would have to be moved. And then the next portion over here shows Luakini extending through the parking lot where the outlets, the Lahaina outlets, were located. And this rendering is showing kind of the extension. What I want to focus on is Luakini, where it runs through Foodland and the Lahaina outlets. And the concept here was that these are very, very large blocks and that the community might be better served if they were smaller blocks, brings the community together more. And they gave some examples. But you'd have Luakini going through those two big blocks, and then there would be crossroads also cutting through those blocks. So instead of having two very large blocks, you wind up with 8 smaller blocks. And you can see that on this illustration, all of them have access back up to the highway. And in one of the illustrations, I'm sorry, I don't have it here, this area up here was kind of a shuttle area. So you could have parking across the highway from Lahaina. The idea that eventually that highway would not be used as much and it would be a smaller, safer highway. And then there would be shuttles that would bring people in here to central Lahaina. So again, just concepts, ideas for discussion. But I thought you might be interested in knowing, well, what some of the plans might be. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of concepts for Front Street. One is Front Street as a, quote, plaza, and one is Front Street as a park. So starting with the plaza view, what this shows is storefronts. So this would be like Fleetwood's and ABC store and Coco Nene and some of the other storefronts that were out there, opening up onto what in some cases you can see is a much wider sidewalk, moving Front Street over. So I'm assuming this would be so narrow that it would have to be one-way street, and then showing more shade trees and bike ramps and things like that on the other side of the street. So that would be one idea. That is the plaza view. The park view, again, shows sort of wider sidewalk in front of some of the retail and the restaurants on the Mauka side. Again, nothing on the ocean side, no retail, no shops over there, at least in these renderings. And Front Street sort of meanders like a lazy river. Again, narrower, so it's one-way traffic, and the winding aspect here would serve to slow traffic a bit. So all of that served to sort out the accessibility, the connectivity, some of the safety aspects of Lahaina. Another thing that's been so important to all of you and everybody that was in that room was maintaining that character, the historic look of Lahaina. And so some of the architects, I thought it was interesting. What you're seeing if you're on YouTube is two pictures of the storefront. So this is 744 Front Street, better known as Fleetwood's. And what the two pictures show is the original building and what that looked like as compared to what the building looked like in, well, July of 2023. And so it was to point out some of the historic details that have been changed over the years and at least present the idea of perhaps going back to the original buildings as opposed to the 2023 versions and at least get ideas. And so it seems to me that there is an appropriate level of detail and concern around maintaining the historic nature of Lahaina. Now, they didn't show anything historic or otherwise on the ocean side of Lahaina, Front Street. I was impressed that the county brought in companies from across the U.S. that appear to have real expertise in town planning. I do have concerns. There wasn't much discussion about the retailers and landowners in the meeting, although I know there were some in attendance. And I only saw one bullet at one point on one of the dozens of posters that mentioned the word jobs. And whenever I discussed the Mackay side of Front Street, the ocean side, with one of the planners or the architects, their response was, "There is a path." A couple of the planners patiently explained to me that they're concerned about sea rise. I patiently explained to them that anywhere in the world that I've traveled, Asia, Europe, other US cities, Canadian cities, anywhere where there is shoreline, there are businesses and buildings built on and over the water and the sea, the one that's rising. We have the technology now, and if we're concerned about events that may happen at the end of the century, according to at least one NOAA report, well, we'll have even more advanced technology by then. Plus, those of us at the meeting, and I really hated to point this out, we're probably not going to live that long. I found it really distressing that they just seem to be giving up on the idea of anything on the Mackay side of Front Street. And at the end of the final presentation, I had a chance to speak briefly with the gentleman, the national town planning expert, and I mentioned that I was concerned that not one of the many, many renderings showing such a variety of possibilities, not even one showed a restaurant or any retail space on the ocean side. I told him that the absence of even one option sets the expectation, rightly or wrongly, implying that the aforementioned path, it's really not an option. He seemed genuinely concerned, and he started taking notes and said, "That is a very interesting observation." He seemed sincere, so now I'm expecting that we will see at least one rendering, maybe a few renderings and ideas to help support the idea of bringing back the charm and ambience, not to mention the tax revenue of some of those oceanfront restaurants. And on the bright side, we'll get another chance for input because remember, I said this is the plan for planning the plan. There are follow-up meetings scheduled for September. So by then, more than 2 years after the event, our county will still be in the information gathering process when what many of us want is more progress. And while I'm sure that many of you understand and maybe even share my impatience, I do understand the county is trying to balance the need for urgency with the need to have community input in attempting to do it right. Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you have comments or questions, drop them below or shoot an email to me, lee@alohapods.com. I answer every one. And if you like this one, give us a like and maybe send this episode to someone you know who's thinking about Maui. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss a thing. Well, that's all for now. So, from the greatest island on earth, this is Lahaina Lee saying, Aloha. Tony Brown produced this podcast. The information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It's not intended as a recommendation to invest in real estate or any other financial asset. We are not financial planners, certified public accountants, or attorneys. You should consult with a qualified professional before making any financial, legal, or investment decisions. All investments carry risk, and past performance is not indicative of future results.